Unit 731. Unit 731 was a Japanese military research unit operating out of Pingfan, Manchuria during World War II. It was run by a microbiologist named Shiro Ishii, who held the rank of general by the time the war ended. Officially, the unit studied disease prevention for Japanese troops. In reality, it tested biological weapons on living people, mostly Chinese, Korean, and Russian prisoners, along with some Allied POWs. Prisoners were called marutas, which means logs, a word chosen specifically so guards wouldn't think of them as people. They were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid, so researchers could study exactly how each disease spread and killed inside the human body. Doctors performed surgeries on fully conscious prisoners without anesthesia, removing organs while the person was still alive, because anesthesia could alter the tissue and ruin the data they were collecting.
Some prisoners had limbs frozen solid in frostbite experiments, then thawed by different methods to study which caused the most tissue death. Beyond the facility itself, Ishii's unit dropped ceramic bombs packed with plague-infected fleas over Chinese villages to test whether outbreaks could be triggered from the air alone. Researchers estimate at least 3,000 people died inside the Pingfan facility alone. Some historians believe the death toll from field testing of biological weapons across occupied China runs into the hundreds of thousands. When the war ended, American occupation officials secretly offered Ishii and his senior researchers immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for their data on human responses to biological agents, data the U.S. believed no other country had. Not one person from Unit 731 stood trial at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal.
Ishii lived out the rest of his life freely in Japan and died of throat cancer in 1959. Josef Mengele. Josef Mengele was an SS doctor stationed at Auschwitz starting in 1943, where prisoners nicknamed him the Angel of Death. He had a personal obsession with twins and would walk along the arrival platform himself, pulling twin children out of the line before anyone else could touch them. Around 1,500 pairs were selected for his research over roughly 2 years, close to 3,000 individuals total. He injected chemicals directly into their eyes in an attempt to permanently change eye color. He performed invasive surgeries without any anesthesia, and in at least one documented attempt, tried to surgically join two twins together at the back to create a conjoined pair, an operation that killed both children within days from gangrene. When one twin died of illness or injury, Mengele would have the other one killed immediately by lethal chloroform injection, so he could perform both autopsies on the same day under identical conditions and compare the organs directly. Out of the roughly 3,000 twins he studied, only about 200 survived to see liberation in January 1945. Mengele fled Europe after the war and spent over 30 years living under false names across South America, briefly working as a farm manager in Argentina, and later hiding in rural Paraguay and Brazil with help from sympathizers. He died in Brazil in 1979, drowning during a swim, having never once been caught or stood trial for what he did. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began tracking 600 black men in Macon County, Alabama, as part of a study on the natural progression of untreated syphilis. 399 of the men actually had the disease. None of them were ever told. Instead, they were told they were being treated for a vague condition called bad blood and given free meals, free physical exams, and burial insurance in exchange for staying in the study. The real goal was simply to watch the disease slowly destroy their bodies over decades and record the results. By the 1940s, penicillin had become the standard, widely available cure for syphilis everywhere else in the country. The men in the study were deliberately kept from learning about it or receiving it because curing them would have ended the research. The study continued like this for 40 years. Wives were infected by their husbands. Children were born with congenital syphilis.
It only ended in 1972, after a public health service employee named Peter Buxton leaked internal documents to journalist Jean Heller, whose Associated Press story broke nationally and forced the government to shut the study down within weeks. By the time it ended, at least 28 men had died directly from syphilis, with dozens more dead from related complications like heart disease. The U.S. government did not formally apologize until 1997, when President Clinton apologized in person to the 8 remaining survivors at the White House. The Guatemala syphilis experiments. In 1946, the same U.S. Public Health Service doctor behind parts of the Tuskegee study, John Cutler, ran an even more direct experiment in Guatemala with the cooperation of the Guatemalan government. Researchers deliberately infected soldiers, prison inmates, and patients inside a mental asylum with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or any form of consent in order to test whether penicillin could prevent infection immediately after exposure. Sex workers carrying the diseases were paid by researchers to have intercourse with prisoners as the initial method of infection. When that method didn't infect people quickly or reliably enough, doctors switched to injecting the bacteria directly into people's skin, their genitals, and in some cases, their spinal fluid. Around 1,300 people were infected through the program in total. Records later uncovered showed that not everyone who was infected received proper treatment afterward, and some were simply left untreated. The entire program stayed buried for over 60 years until a medical historian stumbled onto John Cutler's personal files in a university archive in 2010. The United States government formally apologized to the people and government of Guatemala that same year. No one involved in designing or running the experiment was ever criminally charged in either country. The Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. During World War II, the U.S. military urgently needed an effective treatment for malaria to protect soldiers fighting in the Pacific Theater. In 1944, researchers turned to inmates at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois to test potential drugs. 441 prisoners volunteered to be deliberately infected with malaria through mosquito bites, lured by the possibility of reduced sentences that prison officials strongly implied but never officially guaranteed. Once infected, the men were given a rotating series of experimental anti-malarial drugs at doses doctors weren't entirely sure were safe, specifically to see which combinations cured the disease and which ones made the men violently, dangerously ill. The study became something of a public relations success at the time, even praised in a glowing Life magazine feature about patriotic prisoners helping the war effort. After the war, defense lawyers representing Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials pointed directly to Stateville as their justification, arguing that if American prisoners could legally be experimented on under the banner of informed consent, German doctors deserved the same legal standard. The argument ultimately failed to save the Nazi doctors from conviction, but it forced uncomfortable questions about prison research in America that wouldn't be properly addressed by federal law for another 30 years. The plutonium injection experiments. Between 1945 and 1947, scientists connected to the Manhattan Project urgently needed to know exactly how plutonium behaved once it entered the human body. 18 hospital patients in cities including Rochester, Chicago, and Oak Ridge were secretly injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent as part of the research. Doctors specifically selected patients they believed had terminal illnesses, assuming none of them would live long enough afterward for anyone to notice or ask questions. Several of those patients went on to live for decades, completely unaware that they were carrying radioactive material embedded in their bones the entire time. The program stayed fully classified for nearly 50 years. It was only exposed publicly in 1993, after an investigative journalist spent years filing government records requests and obtained internal Manhattan Project documents confirming the experiments. The resulting federal investigation confirmed 18 direct victims of plutonium injection, though researchers involved in the review believe the true number of radiation experiments quietly conducted on unwitting Americans throughout the Cold War runs into the hundreds. President Clinton issued a formal apology to the victims and their families and ordered financial compensation in 1995. The Holmesburg prison experiments.
From 1951 to 1974, dermatologist Albert Kligman ran extensive skin and chemical testing on inmates at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, the overwhelming majority of them black men. Kligman was later quoted describing his first visit to the prison yard, saying that all he saw before him was acres of skin. Inmates were paid small amounts of cash, sometimes just a few dollars a day, to have chemicals, foot powders, deodorants, and experimental pharmaceutical compounds applied directly onto patches of their skin, occasionally dozens of separate patches at once across a single man's back and arms. Some inmates were knowingly exposed to dioxin, the highly toxic chemical later found in Agent Orange, in tests partly funded by Dow Chemical and the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Research Division. Many of the men developed permanent scarring, open sores, and lasting skin damage that never fully healed. The full scope of the program wasn't exposed to the public until a 1998 book pieced together decades of buried prison medical records and internal university files. By then, Kligman had already used data and funding generated through the prison work to help develop Retin A, one of the most commercially profitable dermatology drugs ever sold. He faced no criminal consequences for any of it and died a wealthy man in 2010. In 2000, more than 300 former Holmesburg inmates sued the university, the doctor, and the companies involved. But a Pennsylvania court ruled the case had been filed too many years after the fact and dismissed it. The Vipeholm Experiments. In 1945, the Swedish government wanted definitive scientific proof of exactly how sugar caused tooth decay. Researchers selected patients living at Vipeholm, a state institution for people with severe intellectual disabilities who were legally incapable of consenting to anything done to them. For roughly 10 years, staff fed patients extreme quantities of sugar and specially designed sticky caramel toffee engineered to stick between their teeth for as long as physically possible. Some patients were given 24 pieces of this toffee a day on top of their regular meals, far beyond anything resembling a normal diet. Researchers then tracked the patient's teeth rotting in real time, recording cavities as they formed. Many patients developed severe cavities, painful abscesses, and constant dental pain, with no additional treatment provided beyond whatever the study itself required to continue collecting data. The results turned out to be genuinely useful, conclusively proving that sugar eaten between meals causes far more decay than sugar eaten alongside meals, and the findings went on to shape Sweden's national dietary guidelines for decades afterward. The institution's vulnerable patients were never once asked whether they wanted to take part. The Monster Study. In 1939, a graduate student named Mary Tudor, working under University of Iowa professor Wendell Johnson, ran a speech experiment on 22 orphaned children living at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Half of the children already stuttered, half did not. Tudor told the children who didn't stutter that they were beginning to show clear signs of a serious worsening speech defect and that they needed to correct it immediately, even though there was genuinely nothing wrong with their speech. She criticized every single hesitation, pause, and stumble in their normal childhood speech, no matter how minor or ordinary it actually was. Several of the children who were falsely told they had developed a stutter went on to develop real, lasting speech problems that followed them well into adulthood, along with deep anxiety around speaking in front of other people for the rest of their lives. The study was deliberately kept hidden for over 60 years because researchers and the university feared the public backlash if it ever came out. It wasn't publicly exposed until 2001, when a newspaper investigation tracked down several of the surviving victims and published their stories. The University of Iowa issued a formal public apology, and in 2007, the state of Iowa agreed to pay roughly $925,000 to the 6 surviving victims. The Willowbrook State School Hepatitis Experiments. Willowbrook was a severely overcrowded state institution for children with intellectual disabilities located on Staten Island, New York. Conditions inside were so unsanitary that nearly every single child admitted there eventually caught hepatitis naturally within months of arriving. Starting in the 1950s, researcher Saul Krugman decided to use that grim fact to his advantage rather than fix it. He deliberately infected healthy, newly admitted children with hepatitis, sometimes through direct injection and sometimes by feeding them extracts made from infected feces, specifically to study how the disease progressed and to test early gamma globulin treatments. Parents desperate to get their children off years-long waiting lists were told their child would be admitted far faster if they agreed to enroll them in the program, and many felt they had no real choice but to say yes. The experiments continued for years before a Harvard anesthesiologist publicly listed Willowbrook among the most unethical medical studies in American history in a landmark 1966 article. A 1972 television expose on the school's horrific living conditions finally forced state officials to act. Willowbrook didn't fully close until 1987, and the case became one of the defining turning points for informed consent law in the United States. Project 4.1. In 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands as part of a test called Castle Bravo. The resulting blast was more than twice as powerful as scientists had predicted, and radioactive fallout drifted directly over the inhabited atoll of Rongelap, far outside the planned danger zone. 239 Marshall Islanders and 28 American servicemen were exposed to fallout for days before anyone moved to evacuate them.
Instead of simply treating the exposed islanders and moving on, the U.S. government quietly launched what it officially called Project 4.1, described publicly only as a medical survey. In practice, it turned the islanders into the subjects of a decades-long study on the long-term effects of radiation exposure on human beings, closely tracking thyroid cancers, growth abnormalities, and birth defects that appeared in children born afterward. Some declassified accounts allege officials deliberately allowed islanders to return home to land that was still contaminated, specifically so the long-term biological effects could continue to be measured over time. Full compensation and formal acknowledgement from the United States took decades to arrive, and elevated cancer rates on the affected islands continued for multiple generations. MKUltra. Starting in 1953, the CIA ran a covert program called MKUltra dedicated to finding reliable ways to control the human mind.
Subjects included prison inmates, psychiatric patients, and ordinary members of the public who never agreed to take part and never even knew they had been specifically targeted. Under an operation nicknamed Midnight Climax, CIA agents set up government-funded safe houses where paid sex workers lured unsuspecting men inside, secretly dosed their drinks with LSD, and let agents quietly observe their reactions from behind one-way glass. One government scientist, Frank Olson, was secretly given LSD during a work retreat in November 1953 without any warning. Just days later, he fell from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York City and died on the sidewalk below. His death was officially ruled a suicide for over 20 years, until his family eventually uncovered the CIA's role in drugging him and began publicly demanding answers. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the vast majority of MKUltra's records destroyed just ahead of a looming congressional investigation. The full scope of the program only came to light years later, after a 1977 Freedom of Information request turned up roughly 20,000 surviving documents that had been mistakenly filed away in a financial records warehouse instead of being destroyed along with the rest. No one involved in the program was ever criminally prosecuted, and Olson's family only received a formal apology and a $750,000 settlement from the U.S. government in 1976, decades before they learned the full truth. If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.